Well, hello again. I expected Chapter Two's forum discussion topic would generate lively discussion, and you did not disappoint. The discussion was quite good. Most of you have shown an ability to articulate your viewpoints while being respectful of those with whom you disagree. If only our contemporary society was more like this. Now, these are the kinds of difficult cases appeals courts must face and must decide on the basis of the law, not on public opinion. In some ways, this particular case illustrates, as Dr. Cheeseman writes in the text, the Constitution changes, but the Constitution never changes. Yes, we've talked about this before. It is a bit of a paradox, perhaps, but it does go to show how the Constitution is a living and breathing instrument of government and governance. Now, the government was not always involved in marriage, but for many of the reasons that some of you have clearly articulated, eventually the government did get involved, and for a number of reasons. Now, what we have to remember here is that the government's definition and purpose for recognizing marriage need not be in lockstep with any religious definition of marriage. What emerges from this case is the court's view that for the government, marriage is a form of contract law, essentially a shorthand method to provide a range of contractual benefits to the parties in the marriage contract as well as any dependents. Some have suggested the solution may be for the government to legislate and manage domestic contracts and allow the term marriage to be relegated to its religious origins. And of course, there are many who would disagree with that perspective. Now, let's move on to this week's discussion from Chapter 5, Intentional Torts and Negligence. Now, this is an interesting chapter because the material in this chapter provides you with your first real personal opportunity to resolve conflicts placed before you by weighing the respective rights, duties, and obligations that arise from a civil dispute in court. I guess the first thing we need to do is define what is a tort. Tort is the French word for a wrong. Under tort law, an injured party can bring a civil lawsuit to seek compensation for a wrong done to the party or the party's property. Most torts are either intentional torts or unintentional torts, such as negligence. Now, the text also discusses another category, strict liability, and you should read up on that as well. Now, these categories and the entire concept of a tort are based on the concept of fault. Torts are different than criminal acts and generally fall under the jurisdiction of civil court rather than criminal court. Incidentally, there are instances where both a criminal case and a civil case based on the same acts can arise, but they are handled separately. Now, in criminal court, the decisions are largely binary, guilty or not guilty. In civil court, a tort allows perhaps a bigger picture perspective. In a civil case, the judge, jury, and especially parties to the case will be asked to look at the variety of resolution paths available to them rather than just one right answer. Another interesting aspect of the material in this chapter is that it introduces you to the concept of elements or components of a tort or crime, or for that matter, most legal doctrines. Hopefully, it'll encourage you to think in terms of negligence, not as the first answer, but rather as the result of a component building block process, where negligence is the product of showing that the elements are all in place. Now, this process may not only help you to make difficult legal doctrines more comprehensible, but also introduce you to the underlying logic of thinking like a lawyer. Now, let's move on to our assignments. This week's IRAC writing assignment calls on your research skills. The case is from the appeals court in the state of Texas and is found on page 103 of your text. It is the negligence critical legal thinking case involving death by bee sting. You'll have to go online and research the case in order to complete all elements of the IRAC format. There are additional details in the assignment. Now, for our forum discussion question, we look to another tort concept, breach of the duty of care, in the ethics case on pages 92 and 93. It's the Liebeck versus McDonald's restaurants case from New Mexico. And it's why coffee cups now come with printed warnings that contents may be hot. So that's quite a bit of work for you this week. A lot of reading and a lot of terms for you to be aware of here in Chapter 5. Next week, we move on to Chapter 6, Criminal Law and Cyber Crimes, and we'll then be ready for our first exam. We'll talk more about the exam next week. Have a great week, everybody.